The evening sky over New Terra Colony glowed with soft orange and purple hues as Marcus Webb walked down the sidewalk, holding his daughter's small hand in his. Sophie was 7 years old, and she bounced beside him with energy that never seemed to run out even after an hour of gymnastics practice. She talked rapidly about the new moves she learned today, and how her instructor said she was getting really good at cartwheels. Marcus smiled and nodded and listened to every word, because these moments were precious to him. He worked long hours as a federal judge for the Outer Colonies Circuit Court, and sometimes he worried he didn't spend enough time with his daughter. Her mother had died 3 years ago, and since then it had been just the two of them building a life together on this new world far from Earth. Marcus wore comfortable clothes tonight, because he had come straight from home to pick up Sophie from the community center. His jacket was old and worn, and his shirt had a small stain from the coffee he spilled that morning. He looked like any other tired parent at the end of a long day. His mind wandered between listening to Sophie and thinking about the case files waiting for him on his desk at home. There was a complex dispute about mining rights on one of the outer colonies, and he needed to review hundreds of pages of documents before the hearing next week. He glanced around the neighborhood as they walked, taking in the buildings and the people, and the way the light fell across the plaza. This was a nice area of New Terra Colony where families lived and children played in the parks and everyone seemed to know each other. 2 police officers stood near their patrol vehicle on the other side of the plaza. Daniel Price was a 5-year veteran of the Colonial Police, and his partner Greg Holmes had been on the force for 3 years. They were drinking coffee and talking about the recent string of burglaries in this neighborhood when Daniel noticed Marcus and Sophie walking past the Riverside apartments. Something about the man caught his attention, though he couldn't quite say what it was. Maybe it was the way Marcus looked around, carefully observing his surroundings. Maybe it was that he seemed out of place in this area. Daniel set down his coffee and touched Greg's arm to get his attention. Daniel spoke into his communication device and said, "Dispatch, this is Unit 7, and we have a suspicious individual near the Riverside apartments, and we are moving to investigate." Greg nodded, and both officers started walking across the plaza toward Marcus and Sophie. Their hands rested on their equipment belts in a casual way that was second nature to them after years of training and patrol work. Marcus noticed the officers approaching from the corner of his eye, but he didn't think much of it at first. Police were common in all parts of New Terra Colony, and he had no reason to think they were interested in him. He continued walking and listening to Sophie, who was now explaining in great detail how she had helped another girl in her class learn to do a handstand. Marcus felt proud of his daughter's kindness, and he was about to tell her so, when he heard a voice call out from behind them. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said, and Marcus recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice of authority and command. He stopped walking and turned around slowly. Sophie stopped talking mid-sentence and looked up at her father with confusion in her brown eyes. The 2 officers were now standing about 10 feet away, and the taller one named Daniel had his hand resting on the stunner at his belt. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach because he had been in this position before back on Earth, and he had hoped those days were behind him. "There are problem, officers?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. Years of working in courtrooms had taught him how to control his emotions and present a composed exterior, even when he felt angry or afraid. Daniel stepped closer, and his eyes moved up and down, taking in Marcus's appearance from his worn shoes to his casual jacket. "We have had reports of suspicious activity in this area," the officer said, "and there have been several break-ins over the past week, so I am going to need to see your identification." Sophie squeezed her father's hand tighter, and Marcus felt her small fingers trembling. "Daddy, what is happening?" she whispered, and her voice was so quiet that only Marcus could hear it. He looked down at his daughter and saw fear starting to form in her eyes, and it made his heart ache. "It is okay, sweetheart," he said softly before turning back to the officers and saying, "I live 2 blocks from here, and my daughter and I are just walking home from her gymnastics class." Greg moved to Marcus's other side, creating a triangle formation that made Marcus feel surrounded. "That was not what Officer Price asked you," Sir Greg said, and his voice was harder than his partner's. "Your identification, please," he added. Marcus took a slow breath and felt the weight of this moment pressing down on him. He knew what was happening here, and he knew why it was happening, but he also knew he had to stay calm for Sophie's sake. "I am reaching for my wallet now," he said, clearly making sure both officers could see his hands as he slowly moved them toward his pocket. His fingers found his wallet and he pulled it out, carefully like he was defusing a bomb. Inside was his identification card with his name and photograph and his title as federal judge of the Outer Colonies Circuit Court. He handed the card to Daniel and watched as the officer examined it with skeptical eyes. Sophie started to cry quietly beside him, and the sound of her tears was worse than any insult or threat the officers could have made. Marcus wanted to pick her up and hold her and tell her everything would be okay, but he knew that any sudden movement might be misinterpreted. Daniel looked at the identification card and then looked at Marcus and then back at the card. "This says you are a federal judge," he said, and his tone made it clear he did not believe it. "Do you expect me to believe that?" he asked. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest like hot water, but he kept his voice level when he replied and said, "I can call my office and verify my identity if you would like." The situation began to draw attention from people passing by and residents who lived in the nearby apartments. Several people stopped walking and turned to watch what was happening. Some of them pulled out their personal devices and started recording the interaction. Marcus was aware of every person watching and every camera pointed in his direction. He knew that this moment would be documented and shared and analyzed. He knew that what happened here tonight would matter not just for him and Sophie, but potentially for many other people on New Terra Colony. Greg ignored Marcus's offer to verify his identity and instead asked, "Why were you looking around so much and you kept checking the buildings and watching people, and that is textbook suspicious behavior?" Marcus felt exhausted by the accusation because it was so absurd. "I was admiring the architecture," he said, "and I was making sure my daughter did not trip on the uneven pavement, because the sidewalk here has several cracks and she is 7 years old and sometimes she does not watch where she is walking when she is excited." "Is that a crime?" he asked. Daniel's face hardened at Marcus's response and he said, "Do not get smart with us and we are just doing our job. Now I am going to need you to place your hands behind your back while we verify your story." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sophie's crying grew louder and she said, "Please do not hurt my daddy," and her voice cracked with fear. The words cut through the evening air and several people in the growing crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Leave them alone and they are not doing anything wrong." Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level even though the officers protested and told him to stay standing. He looked into Sophie's tear-filled eyes and spoke softly. "Sophie, baby, look at me," he said. "I need you to be brave right now, and can you do that for me?" The little girl nodded even though tears were streaming down her cheeks. Marcus gently wiped the tears away with his thumb. "Good," he said. "Now I want you to remember something important, and what is happening right now is not right. But we are going to stay calm and we are going to get through this together. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded again and Marcus kissed her forehead before standing back up. He addressed the officers with steel in his voice that came from years of commanding courtrooms. "I will cooperate with your investigation," he said, "but I am asking you to consider the traumatic effect this is having on my child because she is 7 years old and she should not have to see her father treated like a criminal when he has done nothing wrong." Daniel and Greg looked at each other uncertainly. The confidence they had felt when they first approached Marcus was starting to crack. The crowd was getting bigger and people were shouting and some were calling the officers racist and others were saying, "This is wrong." A woman pushed through the crowd with determination on her face. She was in her mid-40s with short gray hair, and she walked right up to the officers without fear. "That is Judge Webb," she said loudly. "I appeared before him in court last month, and what are you doing?" Her words seemed to hit Daniel and Greg like cold water. They both turned to look at her, and Daniel said, "Ma'am, please step back and let us do our job." But the woman did not step back. She stood her ground and said, "Your job is not to harass innocent people, and that man is a federal judge, and you two are making a huge mistake." More voices joined hers from the crowd. A young man said, "I work at the courthouse, and that is definitely Judge Webb, and you two need to apologize right now." An elderly couple said, "We have lived in this neighborhood for 10 years, and Judge Webb and his daughter walk past our house every week, and they are good people." The voices kept coming one after another, creating a chorus of support for Marcus and condemnation for the officers. Greg pulled out his data pad with shaking hands and ran a verification check on Marcus's identification card. His face went pale as the results came back on the screen. The data pad displayed Marcus's full credentials, including his photograph, in judicial robes and his case history and his commendations for service to the colonial justice system. It showed that he had served as a federal judge for 3 years, and before that he had been a prosecutor and before that a public defender. It showed that he had graduated top of his class from law school on Earth, and that he had moved to New Terra Colony after his wife died to give his daughter a fresh start. It showed everything except a reason why he should have been stopped and questioned and threatened with arrest. Greg showed the datapad to Daniel, and Marcus watched as the officer's face changed from confidence to uncertainty, to something that looked like fear. Sir Daniel started to say, but his voice trailed off. Marcus looked at both officers with an expression that held no triumph and no satisfaction. He just looked tired and disappointed. "I assume you have confirmed my identity now," he said. "And it was not really a question." Daniel cleared his throat and said, "Judge Webb, we're just following protocol, and the description we had was vague, and with the recent crime in the area, we have to be careful." Marcus interrupted him, and his voice was quiet, but it carried power. "The description," he said. "What description exactly matched a man walking with his young daughter after gymnastics class? Tell me, officers, what was the description?" The officers had no answer because there had been no description. Everyone standing there knew it, and the truth hung in the air heavy and undeniable. There had been no call about a suspicious person in this area. There had been no description to match. There had been only assumptions based on how Marcus looked and where he was walking. Daniel and Greg stood there in silence while the crowd watched and waited. Sophie was still crying, but quieter now, and she pressed her face against her father's leg. Marcus placed his hand on top of her head in a protective gesture that was both gentle and fierce. He looked at the officers and waited for them to say something and to acknowledge what they had done, but they just stood there looking at their feet. The moment stretched out painful and uncomfortable for everyone except Marcus, who had lived through moments like this before and knew how to endure them. A police vehicle pulled up to the scene with lights flashing but no siren. The driver's door opened and Captain Lisa Hayes stepped out. She was a woman in her late 40s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen enough in her 20 years of police work to recognize a bad situation when she saw one. She had heard the radio chatter about Unit 7 investigating a suspicious person, and then she had heard the address, and something had made her decide to come check on the situation herself. Now, as she took in the scene before her with the crying child and the tense judge and her two officers who looked like they wished they could disappear, she knew her instincts had been correct. Captain Hayes approached slowly with her hands visible, and her posture open and non-threatening. "Judge Webb," she said with respect clear in her voice, "I apologize for this incident, and may I speak with you?" Marcus looked at her and saw something different from what he had seen in Officers Price and Holmes. He saw awareness and understanding and genuine regret. He nodded curtly and said, "Captain Hayes, I believe you and I need to have a serious conversation about training procedures in your department." The captain did not make excuses or try to defend her officers. She simply said, "I agree completely," and then she turned to Daniel and Greg. "Officers, return to the station immediately," she said, and her voice was like ice. "We will discuss this matter there, and you will both write full reports about what happened here tonight and why you decided to stop Judge Webb. Do you understand?" Both officers nodded and mumbled, "Yes, Captain," and then they walked back to their patrol vehicle. The crowd watched them go with expressions ranging from satisfaction to continued anger. Captain Hayes knelt down so she was at eye level with Sophie. The little girl peeked out from behind her father's leg with red eyes and wet cheeks. "Sweetheart," the captain said gently, "I am very sorry you were scared and your daddy did not do anything wrong. My officers made a mistake, and that is not your fault, and it is not your daddy's fault. Do you understand?" Sophie looked up at Marcus, seeking guidance about whether she should trust this woman. Marcus nodded slightly to show it was okay. "Why did they stop us?" Sophie asked in a small voice. "We were just walking home, and Daddy always holds my hand when we cross the street, and he makes sure I do not trip, and we were not doing anything bad." The question was so simple and so direct, and yet it carried a weight that made several people in the crowd wipe their eyes. How did you explain to a 7-year-old child that sometimes people made judgments about others based on how they looked, and not on what they did? How did you explain centuries of prejudice and fear and bias that had followed humanity from Earth all the way to the stars? Captain Hayes struggled to find the right words. She wanted to be honest, but she also did not want to crush whatever innocence this child had left after tonight. "Sometimes people make unfair judgments about others," she finally said. "It is wrong, and we are going to work very hard to make sure it does not happen again. I promise you that Sophie and I am sorry you had to experience this." Sophie did not respond, but she seemed to accept the answer, or at least accept that there was no better answer available. Marcus declined the captain's offer of a ride home. He wanted to walk the remaining 2 blocks with Sophie just as they had planned. He needed to show his daughter that they would not be intimidated or changed by what had happened. But he did accept Captain Hayes's request to meet tomorrow at her office to discuss the incident formally. She gave him her direct contact information and told him to call any time if he needed anything. Then she stood and watched as Marcus and Sophie walked away hand in hand, disappearing into the growing darkness. The crowd slowly dispersed, but people talked in small groups about what they had witnessed. Some were angry and some were sad and some were just tired of seeing the same patterns repeat themselves over and over. This was New Terra Colony, which was supposed to be humanity's fresh start and a chance to build a better society. But tonight had shown that humans had brought their old problems with them across the light years. Marcus and Sophie walked in silence for the first block. The only sound was their footsteps on the pavement, and the distant hum of traffic and the wind rustling through the alien plants that lined the streets. Sophie's hand was still tight in his, and he could feel her trembling slightly. He wanted to say something to make her feel better, but he did not know what words would help. Finally, as they turned the corner onto their street, Sophie spoke. "Daddy, are we safe here?" she asked. The question pierced Marcus's heart more than anything else that had happened tonight. He had moved to New Terra specifically to give his daughter a better life. After her mother died, he had wanted to escape some of the pain and the memories and, yes, some of the challenges they had faced on Earth. He had believed that humanity's expansion into space might bring not just new worlds but new ways of thinking. He had hoped that his daughter could grow up in a place where she would be judged by her character and not by the color of her skin. "We are safe, baby," he said as they reached their apartment building. He unlocked the door and they stepped inside. "But safety is not just about being protected from bad people," he continued. "It is also about being treated fairly and with respect, and what happened tonight was not about safety. It was about fear and assumptions." Sophie looked up at him, trying to understand. "So the police were afraid of you?" she asked. Marcus nodded slowly and said in a way yes, and they were afraid of something they imagined I might be, instead of seeing who I actually am. Inside their home, Marcus tried to restore some normalcy to the evening. He made Sophie her favorite dinner, which was pasta with butter and cheese, and he let her pick the music they listened to while they ate. But Sophie barely touched her food, and she was quieter than usual. She pushed the pasta around her plate with her fork and stared at nothing. Marcus's own appetite was gone too, but he forced himself to eat because he needed to set an example. After dinner, Marcus ran a bath for Sophie and helped her wash her hair. He read her 3 stories instead of the usual one, and he left the hallway light on because she said she did not want it to be too dark. He sat on the edge of her bed until she fell asleep, and even then he stayed a little longer, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. She looked so small and vulnerable lying there, and he felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in him along with helplessness, because he could not shield her from everything no matter how much he wanted to. Marcus finally left Sophie's room and went to his study. The room was lined with shelves full of law books and legal documents and case files. His desk was covered with work he had brought home, but tonight he could not focus on any of it. He sat in his chair and stared at the wall and felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had devoted his entire adult life to justice and to the belief that the legal system could be a force for equality and fairness. He had studied law because he wanted to help people and protect rights and make sure everyone received fair treatment regardless of who they were or where they came from. But tonight he had seen the gap between what the law promised and what actually happened in practice. He had experienced it through his daughter's tears and through the fear in her voice when she asked if they were safe. All his years of education and all his professional accomplishments and all his dedication to justice had not protected him from being stopped and questioned and treated like a criminal while walking home with his child. If it could happen to him, a federal judge, then what protection did ordinary people have? His personal communicator buzzed and lit up with incoming messages. Word of the incident had spread quickly through New Terra's legal community. Colleagues and friends were reaching out to offer support and express outrage. Some sent short messages saying they were sorry this happened, and they stood with him. Others sent longer messages with offers to help in any way they could. A few suggested he file a formal complaint against Officers Price and Holmes. Several encouraged him to use his position and influence to demand systemic changes in how the colonial police operated. Marcus read through the messages but did not respond to most of them. He appreciated the support, but he also felt isolated in a way that was hard to explain. These people meant well, but most of them could not truly understand what he had experienced tonight. They had not felt the fear of having police officers surround them for no reason. They had not seen their child cry because she was afraid her father would be hurt. They lived in a different reality where police were protectors and helpers and not potential threats. One message stood out from the others. It was from Judge Patricia Lynn, who served on the same circuit court as Marcus. She was a black woman in her 60s who had been a judge for over 20 years. Her message was brief but powerful. She wrote, "I heard what happened and I am so sorry, Marcus, but I am not surprised because I have lived this too many times myself. We need to talk tomorrow after your meeting with Captain Hayes because this cannot continue. Call me when you are ready." The message reminded Marcus that he was not alone in this, even if his pain felt personal and unique. He thought about Sophie sleeping down the hall and about all the conversations they would need to have as she grew up. He would have to teach her about bias and prejudice and how to protect herself when dealing with authority. He would have to prepare her for a world that might judge her unfairly. These were not the lessons he wanted to teach his daughter, but they were necessary for her survival. He remembered his own parents having similar conversations with him when he was young, and how he had promised himself that his children would not need those talks. But here he was decades later preparing to pass down the same painful knowledge. Marcus finally stood up from his desk and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights of New Terra stretched out toward the horizon. The colony was still young and growing. New buildings went up every month and new families arrived from Earth seeking opportunities and adventures. The whole enterprise was built on optimism and hope that humanity could do better out here among the stars. But tonight Marcus felt that hope waver. How could they build a better society when they kept repeating the same mistakes? He went to bed late that night, but sleep did not come easily. He kept replaying the encounter with Officers Price and Holmes. He thought about different things he could have said or done. He wondered if he should have been more forceful in asserting his rights or if that would have made things worse. He thought about what might have happened if the crowd had not gathered to witness and record the interaction. Would he have been arrested? Would Sophie have been taken into protective custody while they sorted everything out? The possibilities made him feel sick. The next morning, Marcus woke early and made breakfast for Sophie. She came out of her room looking tired and subdued. She sat at the table and ate her cereal slowly, without her usual chatter about school or friends or gymnastics. Marcus tried to engage her in conversation, but she gave only short answers. Finally, he sat down across from her and said, "Sophie, we need to talk about what happened last night. Do you have any questions for me?" Sophie looked up from her cereal bowl with serious eyes that seemed too old for her 7 years. "Why did those police officers think you were bad?" she asked. Marcus took a breath and tried to find words that would be honest but age-appropriate. "They did not think I was bad exactly," he said. "They made assumptions about me based on how I look instead of getting to know who I really am. Sometimes people do that, and it is called prejudice. It means judging someone before you know them." "Is it because of our skin?" Sophie asked, and Marcus nodded. "Yes, baby, that is part of it," he said. "Some people still have ideas in their heads that people with dark skin are more dangerous or more likely to do bad things. And those ideas are wrong, but they exist, and they affect how people treat us sometimes." Sophie absorbed this information quietly. Then she asked, "But you are a judge, and judges are good people, so why did they not believe you?" Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "They should have believed me," he said, "but they let their prejudice cloud their judgment, and that is why what they did was wrong." Marcus dropped Sophie off at school and watched her walk through the doors with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She looked so small among all the other children. He wanted to go in with her and stay by her side and protect her from everything, but he knew he could not do that. She had to learn to navigate the world on her own eventually. He just wished the world was kinder. He drove to the Colonial Police headquarters for his meeting with Captain Hayes. The building was made of the same gray concrete as most government structures on New Terra. Inside the reception area was clean and functional, with posters about safety and community partnership. A receptionist directed Marcus to Captain Hayes' office on the 3rd floor. He took the elevator up and walked down a hallway lined with photographs of police officers and commendations and images of the colony's early days. Captain Hayes was waiting for him in a conference room with windows overlooking the city. She stood when he entered and shook his hand firmly. "Judge Webb, thank you for coming," she said. "Please sit down." The room was simple, with a long table and several chairs and a screen on one wall for presentations. There was coffee and water on a side table, but Marcus declined both. He wanted to keep this meeting professional and focused. Captain Hayes sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. "Judge Webb, I want to start by offering my personal apology for what happened last night," she said. "What Officers Price and Holmes did was unacceptable, and there is no excuse for it. They had no reasonable suspicion to stop you, and their handling of the situation showed clear lack of judgment and training. I have already initiated an internal investigation, and both officers have been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Captain, I appreciate the apology, and I appreciate that you are taking action against the officers involved," he said. "But we both know this is not just about two individual officers making a mistake. This is about something deeper and more systemic. This is about implicit bias and inadequate training, and a culture within law enforcement that allows these incidents to keep happening. If it happened to me, a federal judge, then how many times has it happened to people who do not have my position or resources to fight back?" Captain Hayes did not look away from his gaze. "You are absolutely right," she said. "I have been reviewing our training protocols since last night, and there are significant gaps. We teach our officers about proper procedure and legal standards and tactical responses, but we do not adequately address unconscious bias or de-escalation techniques when dealing with the public. We do not spend enough time on community relations or cultural competency. Frankly, our training is focused on enforcement and not on service." "Then let us change that," Marcus said, leaning forward. "I am proposing a comprehensive reform of your training program. Mandatory bias awareness training for all officers with regular refresher courses, enhanced de-escalation training with realistic scenarios, community engagement initiatives where officers spend time getting to know the neighborhoods they patrol. And I am proposing the establishment of a civilian oversight committee that can review complaints and incidents independently." Captain Hayes pulled out a tablet and started taking notes. "These are substantial reforms," she said. "They will require approval from the Colonial Council and significant resources in terms of time and money and personnel. But I agree they are necessary. The question is whether we can get the political support to implement them." Marcus smiled without humor. "I am a federal judge," he said. "I have some influence with the Colonial Council, and I am prepared to use it. I will present this proposal myself at the next council meeting, and I will make it clear that this is not optional. We cannot build a just society if the people sworn to protect it are perpetuating injustice." They spent the next 2 hours working through the details of the reform proposal. Captain Hayes was surprisingly cooperative and receptive to Marcus's ideas. She shared data about previous complaints and incidents that had occurred in the department. Most had been dismissed or resulted in minor reprimands. There was a pattern of behavior that suggested systemic problems beyond just a few bad officers. Some officers had multiple complaints, but continued working without significant consequences. The oversight mechanisms were weak and heavily weighted in favor of police rather than civilians. Marcus took notes and asked questions and began forming a comprehensive picture of what needed to change. He realized this was going to be a massive undertaking that would require months or even years of sustained effort. But he also realized he was in a unique position to make this change happen. He had the legal expertise and the institutional authority, and now he had the personal motivation because he had seen through his daughter's eyes what fear looked like. After the meeting with Captain Hayes, Marcus drove to the courthouse where he worked. The building was newer than the police headquarters, with glass walls and modern architecture, meant to symbolize transparency and openness. He took the elevator to his chambers on the 5th floor and found his assistant Claire waiting with a stack of messages and urgent matters that needed his attention. She looked concerned when she saw him and asked if he was okay. Word had spread through the courthouse about what happened last night. Marcus assured her he was fine and asked her to clear his schedule for the afternoon. He needed time to work on the reform proposal, and he could not focus on regular cases right now. Claire nodded and left him alone in his office. The room was filled with books and legal documents and photographs, including one of Sophie on his desk, smiling at the camera with her front teeth missing. He picked up the photo and looked at it for a long moment before setting it back down and turning to his computer. He spent the rest of the day researching best practices for police reform from Earth and from other colonies. He read studies about implicit bias and its effects on law enforcement. He reviewed case law about civil rights and equal protection. He drafted an outline of his proposal with specific recommendations and implementation timelines. The work was challenging but also energizing because it gave him a sense of purpose and direction. He was channeling his anger and pain into something constructive. That evening, Marcus picked up Sophie from school and took her out for ice cream. She seemed a little more like herself today, laughing when he made silly jokes and telling him about what she learned in science class. But there were still moments when she grew quiet and withdrawn. At one point, while they were sitting in the ice cream shop, a police officer came in to order. Sophie grabbed Marcus's hand tightly and watched the officer with wary eyes until he left. Marcus's heart broke a little more. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly on his reform proposal. He consulted with civil rights experts via long-range communication with Earth. He met with community leaders in New Terra to understand their concerns and experiences with the police. He interviewed officers who were supportive of reform to get their perspectives. He reviewed data and statistics and incident reports until he knew them by heart. Judge Patricia Lynn became a valuable advisor and supporter, helping him refine his arguments and anticipate objections. The work took a toll on him physically and emotionally. He was exhausted most days, and he struggled to find balance between his regular judicial duties and this new mission he had taken on. But he kept going because every time he felt like giving up, he thought about Sophie and about all the other children who deserved to grow up feeling safe and protected rather than afraid. He thought about all the parents who had been stopped and questioned and humiliated in front of their kids. He thought about the kind of society he wanted New Terra to become. Sophie slowly began to recover from the trauma of that night, though Marcus noticed changes in her behavior. She was more hesitant around authority figures, and she asked more questions about fairness and justice. Sometimes she talked about becoming a police officer when she grew up, so she could be one of the good ones. Other times she said she wanted to be a judge like her daddy, so she could make sure people were treated fairly. Marcus encouraged both dreams while privately hoping she would never have to face the same challenges he had faced. The date for Marcus's presentation to the Colonial Council arrived 3 months after the incident with Officers Price and Holmes. The council chamber was a large circular room with seating for council members in a raised semicircle and a floor area for speakers and public attendance. The chamber was packed that evening. Word had spread about what Marcus was proposing, and people had come from all over New Terra Colony to witness the proceedings. Some came to support him, and others came out of curiosity, and a few came because they opposed any changes to how the police operated. Marcus sat in the front row waiting for his turn to speak. Sophie was at home with Claire, who had volunteered to babysit for the evening. Marcus had considered bringing his daughter to show the council members what this issue meant on a personal level, but ultimately he decided she had been through enough. She did not need to be put on display or used as a symbol. He would speak for her and for himself and for everyone else who had experienced injustice. The council chair called the meeting to order and went through several routine items of business first. Marcus listened with half his attention while reviewing his notes one more time. He had practiced his presentation dozens of times until he knew it by heart. But this was different from arguing a case in court. This was personal, and the stakes felt higher. If the council rejected his proposal, then nothing would change, and the next person stopped for being suspicious would have no more protection than Marcus had. Finally, the chair said, "Next on our agenda, we have Judge Marcus Webb presenting a proposal for colonial police reform. Judge Webb, please come forward." Marcus stood and walked to the speaker's podium in the center of the floor. He looked up at the council members and then turned to acknowledge the audience behind him. He saw Captain Hayes sitting in the third row and Judge Patricia Lynn near the back. He saw community leaders and civil rights activists and ordinary citizens who cared about justice. He even saw Officers Price and Holmes sitting near the exit, looking uncomfortable. Members of the council and fellow colonists, Marcus began, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber. "I stand before you tonight not just as a federal judge, but as a father who had to watch his daughter cry in fear because of how my family was treated by those sworn to protect us. 3 months ago, my daughter Sophie and I were stopped by colonial police while walking home from her gymnastics class. We were questioned and surrounded and threatened with arrest despite having committed no crime. The only thing suspicious about us was the color of our skin." He paused to let the words sink in. Some council members looked uncomfortable and others nodded sympathetically. The audience was completely silent. Marcus continued by describing the incident in detail, sparing nothing. He talked about Sophie's fear and her tears and her question about whether they were safe. He talked about the assumptions made by the officers and the lack of any reasonable suspicion for the stop. He talked about how the crowd that gathered had been necessary to prevent the situation from escalating further. "But tonight, I am not here just to tell my story," Marcus said. "I am here to ask a fundamental question. What kind of society do we want to create here on New Terra? We left Earth to build something better and to escape many of the problems that plagued humanity for centuries. But we brought our humanity with us, and that includes both our capacity for greatness and our capacity for prejudice. We have a choice now about which path we take." He then outlined his reform proposal in detail: mandatory bias training for all officers covering the psychology of prejudice and practical strategies for recognizing and overcoming it. Enhanced training in de-escalation techniques with particular focus on interactions with civilians. Community policing initiatives where officers would spend significant time in neighborhoods building relationships rather than just responding to calls. The establishment of a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. Regular public reporting of police stops and outcomes broken down by demographic data to identify patterns. And most importantly, a shift in police culture from warrior mentality to guardian mentality. Each recommendation was backed by research and data and examples from other jurisdictions that had successfully implemented similar reforms. Marcus spoke for 45 minutes, laying out the problem and the solution with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of someone who had lived the consequences of inaction. When he finished, he took a drink of water and said, "I know these reforms will require resources and time and sustained commitment, but the cost of not acting is far greater. Every child who grows up fearing the police instead of trusting them is a failure of our society. Every person who is stopped and questioned because of their appearance rather than their actions is a violation of the principles we claim to hold." The council chair thanked Marcus and opened the floor for questions. Several council members asked about implementation timelines and budget requirements and oversight mechanisms. Marcus answered each question thoroughly, drawing on the research he had done over the past months. Some questions were supportive and others were skeptical. One council member asked whether Marcus was letting his personal experience cloud his judgment and whether these reforms were really necessary. Marcus took a breath before responding. "My personal experience does not cloud my judgment," he said. "It clarifies it. I have spent my entire career in the legal system, and I understand in theory how justice is supposed to work. But theory and practice are not always the same thing. Yes, my experience was personal, but it was also evidence of a larger problem, and if you need more evidence, I can provide you with data on police stops in this colony. Over the past 2 years, the numbers show clear disparities based on race and ethnicity, even when controlling for crime rates and neighborhood factors. This is not about my feelings, and it is about facts." After the question period, the council chair opened public comment. Dozens of people stood to speak. Some shared their own experiences of being stopped or questioned by police without cause. Others spoke about their fear and the fear of their children. A few police officers spoke in support of the reforms, saying they wanted better training and clearer guidelines. Captain Hayes stood and gave a powerful statement about her department's commitment to change and her belief that these reforms would make officers safer as well as the community. Not everyone supported the proposal. Several council members and some citizens argued that the reforms would handcuff police and make it harder to fight crime. They said that officers needed discretion to keep people safe, and that too much oversight would prevent them from doing their jobs effectively. One person said that Marcus was being overly sensitive, and that the officers had just been doing their duty. The comment drew angry responses from the audience, and the council chair had to call for order. The debate went on for over 2 hours. Marcus listened to every word, noting the arguments and the speakers. He could feel the energy in the room shifting as more and more people spoke in favor of reform. Even some who had been skeptical at first seemed to be reconsidering, as they heard story after story of problematic police encounters. The weight of evidence was becoming undeniable. Finally, after all the public comments were heard, the council chair called for a vote. The proposal would need a simple majority of the 15 council members to pass. Marcus watched as the chair went through the roll call one member at a time. The first few votes were yes, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope. But then several no votes came in a row and his stomach tightened. The count went back and forth with some members clearly struggling with their decision. When the final vote was tallied, the result was 11 in favor and 4 opposed. The proposal had passed with a solid majority. The audience erupted in cheers and applause. People stood and hugged each other, and some were crying. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him so powerful that his knees went weak. He gripped the podium to steady himself. Captain Hayes was smiling, and Judge Patricia Lynn gave him a thumbs up. Even Officers Price and Holmes looked thoughtful rather than defensive. The council chair banged the gavel to restore order and said the motion passes and the Colonial Police Reform Package will be implemented beginning next month. Captain Hayes and Judge Webb will co-chair an implementation committee to oversee the process. This is a historic moment for New Terra Colony, and I hope we can all work together to make these reforms successful. The meeting is adjourned. Marcus walked out of the council chamber surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. People shook his hand and thanked him and told him he had done something important. He accepted their congratulations graciously, but inside he felt emotionally exhausted. The past 3 months had taken everything he had, and now that the battle was won, he felt drained. He made his way through the crowd and out into the cool evening air. His communicator buzzed with a message from Claire, saying that Sophie wanted to talk to him. Marcus found a quiet spot and called home. Sophie's face appeared on the screen, looking anxious. "Did they say yes, Daddy?" she asked. Marcus smiled for the first time all evening and said, "Yes, baby, they said yes. We are going to make things better." Sophie's face lit up with joy and she said, "I knew you could do it, Daddy. Because you are the best judge in the whole galaxy." Marcus laughed and felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said. "I will be home soon and we can celebrate together." The implementation of the reforms began the following month. Captain Hayes proved to be a dedicated partner in the effort, bringing energy and commitment that Marcus had not fully expected. She reorganized the training division and brought in experts from Earth to develop new curricula. Every officer in the Colonial Police was required to complete 40 hours of bias awareness training within the first 6 months. The training included video scenarios and role-playing exercises and small group discussions about prejudice and its impacts. The response from officers was mixed. Some embraced the training and said it opened their eyes to behaviors and attitudes they had not recognized in themselves. Others resented being told they were biased and complained that the training was politically motivated. But over time, even the skeptics began to see value in learning better communication techniques and de-escalation strategies. Use of force incidents dropped by 30% in the first year after the training was implemented. The Civilian Oversight Board was established, with 7 members chosen from different sectors of the community. Marcus declined to serve on the board himself, feeling it would be a conflict of interest, but he helped select qualified candidates who understood both law enforcement and civil rights. The board had the power to investigate complaints independently and recommend disciplinary action, including termination for serious violations. Just the existence of real oversight seemed to change behavior within the department. Community policing initiatives started slowly but gained momentum over time. Officers were assigned to specific neighborhoods and expected to spend time there when not responding to calls. They attended community meetings and visited schools and got to know local business owners and residents by name. The initiative was particularly successful in areas that had historically had tense relationships with police. People began to see officers as part of their community rather than as an occupying force. Officers Price and Holmes completed the bias training along with everyone else in the department. They also received additional counseling and were reassigned to desk duty for 6 months. Daniel Price eventually left the police force, deciding it was not the right career for him. Greg Holmes stayed and by all accounts became a better officer. He volunteered to participate in community policing programs and received positive feedback from residents. Marcus saw him once at a community event and they nodded to each other with mutual understanding, if not warmth. The data on police stops began to show changes within the first year. The disparities based on race and ethnicity did not disappear completely, but they narrowed significantly. Officers were more careful about documenting their reasons for stops and more aware of their own potential biases. The Oversight Board reviewed cases where disparities appeared and provided feedback to officers and supervisors. Slowly, the culture within the department began to shift. Marcus continued his regular work as a federal judge, while also serving on the implementation committee. It was demanding, but he found meaning in the dual role. He was shaping not just individual cases but the broader system of justice on New Terra. He gave speeches at community events and schools talking about civil rights and the importance of speaking up against injustice. He became a well-known figure throughout the colony, not just as a judge, but as an advocate for reform. Sophie thrived as she got older, becoming more confident and engaged with the world around her. She joined the debate team at school and frequently argued about justice and fairness. She told Marcus she definitely wanted to be either a lawyer or a judge someday, so she could help people like he did. Marcus encouraged her dreams while also making sure she understood the challenges that lay ahead. But he was proud of her resilience and her determination to make a difference. The reforms were not perfect and problems still occurred. There were incidents where officers fell back on old patterns or where bias influenced decisions. But now there were mechanisms to address those incidents and consequences for officers who violated policies. The culture of impunity that had existed before was breaking down. Officers knew they were being watched and evaluated not just by their supervisors, but by the community they served. Public trust in the police began to improve gradually. Surveys showed that more people felt safe approaching officers, and more believed that complaints would be taken seriously. The change was slow but measurable. Parents reported that their children were less afraid of police. Business owners said they felt like partners with law enforcement rather than adversaries. The reforms were working not perfectly but noticeably. 2 years after the incident that started everything, Marcus and Sophie walked through the same plaza where they had been stopped. It was evening again, and Sophie had just finished gymnastics class just like that night. But this time the walk felt different. The neighborhood looked the same with its buildings and parks and people going about their evening routines. But something fundamental had shifted in ways both visible and invisible. They passed a police officer standing near the community center. The officer smiled and waved at them. "Good evening, Judge Webb, and hello, Sophie," he said warmly. The officer was named Kevin Morris, and he was one of the newer recruits trained entirely under the reformed program. He had never known the old way of policing on New Terra. For him, community engagement and bias awareness were just normal parts of the job. "Good evening, Officer Morris," Marcus replied, returning the smile. Sophie waved back, but Marcus noticed she did not tense up or grab his hand tighter like she used to. She had slowly learned through repeated positive interactions that not all police encounters were threatening. It had taken time and patience, but her fear had gradually been replaced with something closer to neutral acceptance. As they continued walking, Marcus thought about how far they had come. The reforms he had proposed were now fully implemented and had become standard practice. Other colonies had heard about New Terra's success and were adopting similar programs. Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences and advise other jurisdictions. What had started as one painful incident had grown into a movement that was spreading throughout human space. The Colonial Police Department had won an award for community policing excellence from the Federation of Outer Colonies. Captain Hayes had been promoted to police chief, and she continued to champion reform efforts. She had become a mentor to younger officers, teaching them that good policing was about service and protection, rather than power and control. The department still had challenges, but it was fundamentally different from what it had been 2 years ago. Sophie chatted happily as they walked, telling Marcus about a new routine she was learning in gymnastics. She talked about her friends and her teachers and a book she was reading. She was just a kid again, without the weight of fear and trauma that had haunted her for months after the incident. Marcus listened and responded and felt grateful for her resilience. Children could heal when given safety and support, and Sophie had both. They reached their apartment building and went inside. Marcus made dinner while Sophie did her homework at the kitchen table. They talked about her day and his day and the comfortable rhythm of their nightly routine. After dinner, they watched a show together, and Marcus helped her practice her debate arguments for an upcoming competition. She was arguing for stronger civil rights protections, and Marcus was impressed by how well she had absorbed the IE lessons of the past 2 years. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Marcus sat in his study and reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about that evening 2 years ago and how angry and helpless he had felt. He thought about Sophie's tears and her question about whether they were safe. He thought about the long road they had traveled from that moment to this one. It had not been easy, and there had been times when he wanted to give up. But they had persevered and made real change. His communicator, showed a message from Judge Patricia Lynn. She had sent him a news article about another colony implementing police reforms based on New Terra's model. The article quoted Marcus and described him as a leading voice for justice in the outer colonies. He read the article and felt a mixture of pride and humility. He had not set out to become a voice for anything. He had just been a father trying to protect his daughter and make sure what happened to them did not happen to others. Marcus opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photograph. It showed him and Sophie from that night 2 years ago, taken by someone in the crowd who had witnessed the incident. In the photo, Sophie was crying and Marcus was looking down at her with his hand on her head. The image captured pain and fear and injustice. Marcus had kept the photo as a reminder of why the work mattered. Whenever he felt tired or discouraged, he looked at it and remembered what was at stake. But now he realized he did not need the reminder anymore. The work had become part of who he was and what he believed in. He put the photo back in the drawer and closed it. Some memories needed to be acknowledged and honored, but not constantly revisited. It was time to focus on the future rather than the past. The next morning, Marcus and Sophie had breakfast together before school. Sophie was in good spirits and excited about her day. As Marcus drove her to school, she asked him a question. "Daddy, do you think things are really better now?" Marcus considered the question carefully. He had learned not to give Sophie easy answers or false reassurances. She deserved honesty even when the truth was complicated. "I think things are better, yes," he said. "Not perfect, but better. More people are aware of bias and how it affects their behavior. There are systems in place now to hold police accountable. The culture is changing. But change is not a destination, Sophie. It is a continuous process. We have to keep working at it every day." She nodded seriously, absorbing his words. Then she said, "I want to help with that when I grow up. I want to make things fair for everyone." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You already are helping," he said. "Just by being thoughtful and aware and caring about justice. Those are the things that change the world." Sophie smiled at him and then jumped out of the car when they reached her school. Marcus watched her run to join her friends and disappear through the school doors. She looked happy and free and full of possibility. Marcus drove to the courthouse and spent the morning hearing cases. In the afternoon, he had a meeting with the implementation committee to review progress on the police reforms. They discussed new training modules and community feedback and statistical trends. The work was ongoing and would never truly be finished. But that was okay because justice was not a static achievement. It was a constant effort to do better and be better. That evening, Marcus picked up Sophie and they went to the grocery store together. While they were shopping, Marcus noticed a woman staring at him. She approached hesitantly and said, "Excuse me, are you Judge Webb?" Marcus said, "Yes, I am," and smiled politely. The woman's eyes filled with tears and she said, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did. My son is black and he was stopped by police last year. And because of your reforms, they treated him with respect. They did not assume he was a criminal. They just asked him a few questions and let him go. Your work saved him from the kind of trauma I experienced when I was young." Marcus felt moved by her words. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. "That is exactly why the reforms matter." The woman smiled and walked away. Sophie had witnessed the exchange and she looked up at her father with admiration. "You are a hero, Daddy," she said. Marcus shook his head gently. "I am not a hero, baby," he said. "I am just someone who saw something wrong and tried to fix it. Anyone can do that. That is what being a good citizen means." Later that night, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus stood at his window looking out at New Terra Colony. The city lights sparkled in the darkness, and above them, the alien stars of this new world shone bright. Humanity had traveled light years to get here, and they had brought both their best qualities and their worst. But they also had brought their capacity to learn and grow and change. That was the most important thing they carried across the void. Not technology or weapons or even hope, but the ability to look at themselves honestly and choose to be better. Marcus thought about all the people who had supported him over the past 2 years and all the people who had shared their stories and all the people who had worked to implement the reforms. Change was never the work of one person. It was always collective effort. He had played a role, but so had Captain Hayes and Judge Patricia Lynn and the community activists and the council members who voted yes, and even Officers Price and Holmes in their own way by serving as examples of what needed to change. He thought about Sophie growing up in this world and the challenges she would still face. Bias and prejudice had not disappeared, and they never would completely. Human nature included both the capacity for justice and the capacity for unfairness. But at least now there were systems and structures and a culture that pushed toward fairness. At least now there were consequences for those who abused their power. At least now children like Sophie could walk home from gymnastics class without fear. Marcus turned away from the window and went to check on Sophie one more time before going to bed himself. She was sleeping peacefully with her stuffed animals arranged around her and her gymnastics ribbons hanging on the wall above her bed. She looked so innocent and trusting, and Marcus felt a fierce determination rise up in him to protect that innocence and that trust for as long as he could, not by shielding her from reality, but by working to make reality better. He returned to his study and opened his computer to work on a new initiative he was developing. This one focused on reforming the courts themselves to address bias in sentencing and bail decisions. There was always more work to do and more systems to improve. But tonight Marcus felt energized rather than exhausted. He felt like they were building something real and lasting on New Terra.